You can spend lots of time going on YouTube, reading people's blogs, even listening to podcasts like this. But if you can find someone you trust and you understand what they're teaching, they can save you time if you just follow them, if you dive into what they're looking at teaching you. That's why we put together pillarsofpractice.com, a totally free e-course to help you, whether you're a solo practitioner or a group practitioner, to get the basic checklists and trainings that you need to rock out your private practice. So head on over to pillarsofpractice.com to get access to this free e-course. Again, that's pillarsofpractice.com. This is the Practice of the Practice podcast with Joe Sanok, session number 892. I'm Joe Sanok, your host, and welcome to the Practice of the Practice podcast. Well, life, oftentimes we change our minds. We change what we see as healthy or unhealthy. We're raised in certain ways, and we as adults get to choose moving forward what we want to hold on to from what we were given and what we are going to choose to maybe get rid of. I know for myself, I was raised a certain way in a certain religious group, and I switched that when I was in high school into a different religious group, and then changed that. And over the last few years, have definitely found a different place that I feel grounded. And I'm really excited about our conversation today. We cover lots of things on this podcast. We cover all sorts of business and marketing and things like that. And then we also cover some things that are a little bit more clinical. Like even just today in our Ask the Expert with Next Level Practice, we had a Harvard psychiatrist come in and talk about the ketogenic diet and what that does to specifically people that are dealing with schizophrenia, bipolar, diabetes, and really looking at metabolism and mental health together. So we love covering clinical issues as well as the things that help you expand your bottom line and have a thriving practice. And that's why I am so excited to have Susanna with me today. Susanna Guarino, almost messed up your last name. Susanna Guarino is with us, who is an LMHC in private practice license in New York, Rhode Island, Florida, and Arizona. She specializes in religious trauma, spiritual abuse recovery, and couples therapy. She works with clients who have been harmed by high control groups or narcissistic leaders who sought power and control by manipulating and shaming followers rather than helping them. She also works with adult survivors of purity culture. Susanna offers individual, couples, and group therapy online and in person in Rochester, New York. Susanna, welcome to the Practice the Practice podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Joe.
Yeah, well, before we dive into your personal story, I want to start with what we're talking about and what we're not talking about, because I think I want to make sure that, because, we started talking before we were recording about we're not talking about one particular religion or one particular group, even though maybe in our minds we have certain groups that we think of when we think about religious trauma. Will you clarify for us first kind of what we're talking about when we're talking about religious trauma?
Yeah, so the conditions for religious trauma are created when a group or a leader uses religion in order to control other people, to create obedience, to amass power for themselves, rather than helping people or spreading more love in the world, which I think is ideally what religion does. So those are the conditions, and that can happen in any group. So I don't really think about a specific religion when I think about this, because it happens sort of across the board. And then not everyone who has experience in those groups will end up having traumatic symptoms. But the people who do, sometimes people grew up in the group or they joined as an adult and left, they'll often be left with this ongoing fear, anxiety, shame. Sometimes people have nightmares. They struggle in relationships, or they might struggle with authority figures. So the repercussions can be long lasting. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about religious trauma.
Awesome. I just wanted to start with that so that anyone that was like, wait a second, what are you talking about? We have some clarity right at the beginning. So for you, Susanna, why do you care about this work? What got you into this work? What's a little bit of your backstory that you want to share to help us just understand why you got into this?
Yeah. So as they say, all research is me search. And that's true in my case as well. My parents met in a very conservative, culty fundamentalist group. And we were part of that till I was maybe 5, and then we moved into more of like a mainstream evangelical world. But I kind of saw firsthand how the culty dynamics, the really controlling narcissistic leaders, could really damage people for the long term. And that's why I feel so passionate about doing this work and sort of spreading the word that this is happening, and it's happening a lot more than people might think.
Mm. Now, what are some of the things that you would say are core indicators that a group may be leading towards trauma? Because I think that some people, if I even just think about my friend group, some people might say, "Yeah, like this teaching was messed up at this church I was raised in," or "I was raised this way, and I just like this just seems traumatic," and maybe they're using trauma as like a small t trauma. Like, what are things that you've noticed in your work and in the research that really point to, yeah, that's definitely probably a trauma inducing community?
Yeah, that's a great question, Joe. And it can be confusing, especially when you're in it, because things are complicated. Nothing's ever black and white. And people might get a lot from a group while also being sort of harmed by certain dynamics of the group. Um, so, what I refer to is are you familiar with Stephen Hassan's work?
A little bit, and not enough though that I could explain it.
So he's a really well-known guy in the cult awareness world, and in his research, he has the bite model. So a way to evaluate any group or relationship that you're in is in terms of, are they controlling your behavior, information that you're receiving, thoughts that it's okay for you to have, or emotions that it's okay for you to have. And so that's like a framework that you can use to think about. So again, bite. So behavior, information, thoughts, and emotions.
Will you drill into those a little bit? Like, what does that look like? We don't have to go full on tutorial for each of those, but when a group is controlling your behavior, like when I think about religious groups, oftentimes, part of it is that we all agree that this is the behavior we're going to do. We're all going to fast during this time of the year. We're all going to, do these types of behaviors as a way to lead us towards spiritual enlightenment, or closer connection to God, however that group frames it. So on the surface, it's like it seems like every group would fall into behavior, information, thoughts, emotions. Like, how would you parse out that so it's not just a anti-religious discussion, but instead that it's a like here's where that gets dysfunctional?
Yeah, I mean, it gets dysfunctional if they're using shame and fear to manipulate you into doing things that you don't necessarily want to do, and if it's hard for you to say no. Um, so if you are staying up all night meditating because you're really into it and that's what you want to do, great. If you were sort of uh, pushed to stay up all night and they won't let you sleep and you're up for 7 nights in a row and you're starting to lose your sense of reality a little bit, that's more like the behavior control. That's an extreme example.
Yeah, I think that's helpful to just kind of know like where, and I'm sure that that line is a little different in each group. So that bite model is kind of a starting place. So if we think about therapists maybe starting with evaluating their own history, and this may pepper into how they think about their clients as well. But for therapists, what would you want them to think through regarding their own potentially like religious trauma or their history?
Yeah, well, I think therapists who have their own experiences of this are often more aware and keyed in to it than therapists who don't. So, for therapists who don't have experience in a controlling religious group, it can be important for them to like pay close attention to the signs of that in their clients and be really curious about their clients' religious and spiritual histories, which sometimes we don't think to ask about. Um, did you want an example? I have an example that's coming to mind.
Sure, that'd be great.
So, like, I knew someone who had been raised in purity culture in the evangelical world. And like many women raised in that world, she ended up with some sexual dysfunction. She had vaginismus. She wasn't able to basically enjoy intimacy. And her therapist at the time wasn't really familiar with purity culture and kind of leaned on the idea that she must have sexual abuse in her childhood that she didn't remember. Um, and so that number one wasn't true. And the therapist, if she had just been aware that purity culture even exists, maybe she would have been able to help the client understand that that is actually what was playing into this like physical response. It was the trauma of purity culture and the very shaming and fear-based messages around women's sexuality that this woman had been indoctrinated in high school.
Yeah, and I know what purity culture is because I was raised in a lot of that. But if for someone who hasn't, can you dissect that for us a bit?
Yeah, so purity culture was a big movement in the 90s, early 2000s. I think it still exists in maybe a more subtle form, but it's still out there. Sort of preaching that sexuality is really dangerous and bad. Like a lot of like shame and fear-based messages around sexuality, with also a big emphasis on abstinence until you're married. So there was this really famous book called I Kissed Dating Goodbye that a lot of teenagers were reading and getting this message that they should wait to, some kids even waited to kiss their spouse until they got married. And the long term impact of that is that a lot of people struggled with their relationship to their own sexuality. There's a lot of like ingrained fear and shame about those messages that's hard to sort of unpack, even when you're out of that world and you don't think that way anymore.
Yeah. So how does, for adults that are coming to see therapists, if someone said, yeah, I was raised in purity culture, if we just take that as one of many things that we can discuss today, what are some things that therapists that maybe aren't fully familiar with that should know, but also assess for and discuss?
Yeah, I think that therapists should know a little bit about what it is and also just understand the huge impact it can have. Um, it was an educational program about sexuality that taught people that their sexuality was basically bad and scary. And so I see that as like institutionalized sexual abuse. Um, and so therapists can really help validate their clients and empathize with their clients if they ask questions about how that impacted them and are just sort of assess for any history of that. And then help people unpack like what they actually think and how they actually feel about things.
Yeah. As a therapist, I can tell you from experience that having the right EHR is an absolute lifeline. I recommend using therapy notes. They make billing, scheduling, note taking, telehealth, and e prescribe incredibly easy. Best of all, they offer live telephone support that's available 7 days a week. You don't have to take my word for it. Do your own research and see for yourself. Therapy Notes is the #1 highest rated EHR system available today, with a 4.9 out of 5 stars on trustpilot.com and on Google. All you have to do is click the link below or type promo code Joe on their website over at therapynotes.com and receive a special 2-month trial absolutely free. Again, that's therapynotes.com and use promo code Joe on the website. If you're coming from another EHR, Therapy Notes will also import your demographic data quick and easy at no cost, so you can get started right away. Trust me, don't waste any more of your time and try Therapy Notes. Just use promo code Joe at checkout. When you look at your clients that you work with, what are other factors, or let's start with presenting issues. What are presenting issues that you see with religious trauma? And maybe let's take a few others similar to how we kind of dug a little bit into purity culture. What are other major issues that you've seen come up with some of your clients?
I see a lot of anxiety, a lot of uh, fear, a lot of like self doubt because people have been sort of trained not to trust their instincts. Um, I see a lot of shame, like, with any kind of trauma, you end up feeling like it's your fault, like you're the bad one. And with controlling religious groups, they're often preaching like that you're a horrible sinner and you deserve hell and you need, God to save you. And so you get this really deep ingrained message that there's something very wrong with you, like you're not okay and you're not safe. And so even when you're out of the group, that sort of haunts you and it can really impact how you relate to yourself. People tend to be really hard on themselves or they can be really perfectionistic. And it can also relate how you relate to other people. So sometimes people struggle with trusting others. They, if they're feeling sort of insecure, like they're bad, it can be hard to put themselves out there, um, to have standards in relationships, to set healthy boundaries, all sorts of things like that.
Yeah, I mean, just from and maybe you don't know the full like history of a lot of these groups, but maybe you do. How do these groups or these leaders get such power, and why is it often such unchecked power?
Oh, that's a really good idea. Um, I think that narcissists just are really good at seeing where people are vulnerable and then pushing those buttons, especially narcissists who are sort of charismatic, which a lot of cult leaders are. Um, and then I think a lot of times it happens slowly over time. Like, so it's like the frog in boiling water thing where the group might start out really wonderful and helpful and become strange over time. And if they aren't paying really close attention to their own gut feelings, like if they're being told to ignore their gut feelings or that they don't know what's best for them, but the church or the leader knows what's best for them, that can sort of indoctrinate people away from standing up for themselves or thinking for themselves.
Mm. I mean, I think about whether it's politically or religious or, any kind of hot button or personal discussions, like in friends and family or, even in therapy. I mean, I guess therapy is different. I'm kind of formulating my question. I was going to say, how do you confront someone on this? But I guess in therapy, someone's coming typically because they want help in some arena. So you have a little bit more with, like motivational interviewing or things like that. But when you think about seeing friends or family that may be getting involved or are involved in unhealthy spiritual groups, like, do you just let it ride until they come to you? Do you bring it up? Like, what would you say from a peer standpoint? So friend, family, not a client.
That's a really great question, too. I mean, it's really hard when you're the friend or family member of someone who's getting deeper into like an unhealthy group or an unhealthy relationship. Um, Oftentimes, if you confront them directly, you're just going to get their resistance, right? Like their sort of indoctrinated self is going to show up and push back at you. So the best thing that family members and loved ones can do is number one, stay connected. Like don't let the relationship fade away. Don't ever give up because a lot of times, most of the time, I think people eventually come out of these groups. It can just take some time. And then the second thing to do is to ask a lot of questions and just be curious in a way that, as therapists, we're pretty well trained to do this. And sometimes if you're not a trained therapist, it's a little harder. You have to maybe practice this way of doing things and having conversations. But basically, when you're asking a lot of open-ended questions, you're just interested, you're not judging anything, you're helping the people to reconnect with their own mind, with their own critical thinking, and then they can figure out for themselves what's best for them. Because usually, directly telling someone that you think they're in a cult or you think they're in an unhealthy group is not going to get you too far.
Right, right. Well, let's go back to in therapy because our major audience is therapists in private practice. Where are there blind spots that you would say, someone comes in for an intake, or maybe there's a couple that's talking? What are often overlooked things that people miss when it comes to this topic?
That's a really good question. I think generally just asking questions about people's religious history and their spiritual history can be helpful as part of your intake. And um, including helping you determine is the person in a group that's healthy or maybe straying towards an unhealthy direction now? Because some people are just not really aware. But once you start asking them questions and they share with you, you might start to get a better sense of what's going on with them.
And dig into that a little more. Like, what types of questions would you say are really important for people to ask either in an intake or in sessions?
Sure. I mean, so what's your religious background? What's your spiritual background? Do you have a religious group you're part of now? Uh, just pretty basic stuff.
Yeah. So when we're looking at treatment, so you discover someone's had religious trauma. How much of this needs to be someone that's, say, EMDR trained or really like digging into traditional trauma treatment, or are there things that you'd say every general therapist can do these types of treatments, and then maybe also dig into if when should someone refer out to a specialist like yourself to really dig in even deeper than maybe what a generalist would do.
That's another good question. I think there's debate in the therapy world about what the best trauma treatments are. So I won't get into that. But what I've found is people just need a space to talk, and they need someone to reflect back to them what they're hearing. They need a space to be able to have all their feelings, like, because a lot of times in controlling religious groups, you're supposed to put on a happy face all the time. Um, you can be sort of shamed if you have a pretty normal human emotion like jealousy or anger. Especially women often aren't supposed to get angry. Um, so really, like in a therapy space, if the therapist is able to create an atmosphere where the client just feels like they can express all the feelings that they're feeling, that they can share their story, that they can really kind of unpack what happened to them and who they want to be now, and figure out what's important to them now that they're outside of this world. Practice being relational with someone, get some insight into themselves. I think those are like the basic building blocks.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm interested because a lot of what we talk about is the business side of private practice. As you've had this as your specialty, as you niche into this, what have you found to be helpful ways to grow that niche and to attract the ideal client you're looking for? And what are things that maybe you thought were going to work that maybe didn't work?
Hmm. Interesting question. I mean, I found it helpful to just put it out there that I grew up fundamentalist myself, and I, I know quite a bit about that world because I was raised in it. And so I find that clients find me because they know that I am interested and have some experience with that. So I guess my advice for therapists would be, whatever your specialty is, not being afraid to put yourself out there a little bit and share a little bit about yourself, because it can really help clients feel comfortable, and feel confident that you are the right therapist for them, rather than going in sort of blind and not knowing much about you.
Hmm. Yeah. So how have you found that line of how much to disclose? Like, obviously we all have our own stories, and you don't want it to come across as like this is all about me, but also sometimes people can, if they see themselves in your story, they're more likely to work with you. How have you found that balance, and what's worked for you in figuring how much to disclose?
Yeah, that's a good question, Joe. I mean, what I was taught in grad school was never disclose anything that you're still working on personally. But if it's something that you've come through and you feel very confident about, there's less of a risk to you disclosing. So I don't disclose a ton about my background, but I do feel like the sort of broad strokes has been really helpful in helping clients to find me and connect with me.
Mm. Awesome. My final question I always ask is, if every private practitioner in the world were listening right now, what would you want them to know?
I would want them to know that there is so much more out there on religious trauma and spiritual abuse that we didn't have time to get into. So I really hope that they will check out Stephen Hassan's work. And if they want to connect with me, I'm always excited to talk about this, um, to just educate themselves and be aware that this is something many, many more clients than you might think have gone through. And if you're, doing some continuing education, doing it in this topic would be good.
Awesome. And I know you have a free resource, 10 signs you have religious trauma. How can people access that?
Yeah, that's just on my website. They can go sign up for it.
All right. And can you remind us of that website, please?
Yes, it is goodearthcounseling.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on the Practice of the Practice podcast.
You are welcome. Thanks so much for having me.
I love when people find really hyper niche areas that they're interested in, where they want to help the world. And I think that especially as more and more licenses are being accepted across state lines, or it's easier to apply for other states, to be able to really hone in on those hyper niche areas that you're really good at is so important. If you're ever looking for help, in just over a month and a half, we're going to be opening up Next Level Practice again. And so that cohort is going to be kicking off in September 2023. Next Level Practice is our membership community for people that are starting or in solo practice. We have weekly meetings that are live that I and our other consultants host. We bring in experts every single month, and we also have our head of IT, John, who is doing IT training every month. So talking about AI and talking about all sorts of other things like SEO and your websites. As well, we have small groups that we meet in twice a month, and you get accountability partners and access to over 60 e-courses. So if you want to be on that wait list that opens up in September, please make sure you head on over to practiceofthepractice.com/invite. You can read all about it. Typically, people are filling up their practice to the level that they want within 4 to 6 months. It's just amazing to see, and we are so excited to have a whole new cohort kicking off in September. Also, we couldn't do the show without our amazing sponsors. Today's sponsor is Therapy Notes, the best electronic health record out there. If you use promo code Joe at checkout, you will get 2 months for free. We absolutely love Therapy Notes and want you to check them out. They will also help you with transferring over from whatever electronic health records you're using right now. Thank you so much for letting me into your ears and into your brain. Have a great day. I'll talk to you soon. Special thanks to the band Silence is Sexy for that intro music, and this podcast is designed to provide accurate and authoritative information in regard to the subject matter covered. It is given with the understanding that neither the host, the producers, the publishers, or guests are rendering legal, accounting, clinical, or other professional information. If you want a professional, you should find one.